Prime Minister Mark Carney's planned public service cuts are raising new questions over how jobs and services are going to be affected across the country.
And the essence of this is to spend less and invest more. That means reining in government spending so that Canada can invest more as a country.
So that's the Prime Minister back in February of this year. Earlier this month, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne directed cabinet ministers to identify 15% in savings in their individual departments by the end of the summer. That would total $25 billion overall. So a new report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives estimates that by 2028, up to 67,000 public service jobs could be lost over the next 3 years. So for more this morning, we're joined from Ottawa by the report's author, David McDonald, senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Good morning.
Good morning.
Your report outlines which department could bear the brunt of these cuts. We're going to outline those for people now. By 2028, you say more than 14,000 job losses at the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, more than 4,000 at Employment and Social Development, and 4,000 at Citizenship and Immigration. Why would those agencies be most affected?
They're service departments, so they provide a lot of services to Canadians, and therefore they have a lot of staff to provide those services. And so when you ask departments, you got to take a 15% cut. It ends up being a lot more staff in places where you've got a lot of services that are being delivered. These are very frontline departments. So CRA is, this is the department that does your taxes, does business taxes. You got a problem with your taxes, or if you have problems with transfer payment of some kind, like the Canada Child Benefit, that's who you talk to. ESDC, which is second on the list, they manage the Canada Pension Plan as well as employment insurance. So if you have an employment insurance claim that didn't go well, or you're not getting your pension plan payments, that's who you would call. And CIC deals with passports as well as immigration issues. And so if you need a passport in a rush, you're going to be at a CIC office looking to get that done quickly. These are all departments, because they're so service heavy, that Canadians will notice when the service levels decrease, because you're cutting 15% of the staff.
And David, are these full-time positions, part-time positions? Are they mostly administrative, or are they actually full-time positions that deal directly with customer service?
Well, I'm calculating this on a full-time equivalent basis. What would likely happen in terms of the cuts is there'd likely be buyout packages for older workers to leave. And then there are what's called term contract positions where you're not there on a full-time, long-term basis. Folks often string those together to make a full-time job, but those would likely be the first to go. And then it would start to eat into the indeterminate positions. These are sort of full-time, ongoing positions, and so there'll likely be a couple steps to this process. I mean, at this point, we don't have the details of exactly which program lines would be cut. The departments have been asked to produce plans. They're presently working hard to produce those plans. They're going to bring those back at the end of the summer. Yeah. We'll have a budget probably in September or October, and we may have more details at that point as to which departments are going to see the full 15%. There are some departments that are protected, like Defense and the RCMP, but we'll really have to see probably in the fall which departments are hit.
We're going to get to how AI works into this in a moment. But first, your report breaks down where in Canada these job losses occur. No surprise, you're predicting 45% of job cuts would be in Ottawa and Gatineau. That's really the hub of where a lot of these government agencies reside, so they have more employees there. But how will public service workers in other parts of the country be affected?
Yeah, so if we pull out just Ottawa and Gatineau, as you say, it's about 24,000 positions there. There'd be an additional 8,000 or so positions across the rest of Ontario outside of Ottawa. In Quebec, there'd be another 6,000 positions in addition to any job losses in Gatineau, with the rest of the job losses kind of being distributed throughout the country. We will have to see in the fall budget or at some other update point which departments are targeted at this point. This calculation is based on 15% of staff as it exists, in their projections of the 25-26 projections. And so once we get more details about program lines and specific departments, then it'll be easier to figure out what the service impacts would be, but also where the job losses would be.
Right. This comes at the same time as we know the Liberal platform pledges to increase the use of AI in public service, under the guise of it is a better use of your tax dollars. It creates what they would call efficiencies. And that raises some questions, of course, about the looming cuts. What are your concerns when you look at the increased use of AI?
Yeah, AI can be useful in some cases. It's not useful when it's doing critical things like telling you whether you should take a particular deduction on your taxes or not. It's happy to make things up. And so what we don't want is a situation where instead of a person, when you call the CRA hotline, yeah, somebody picks up right away, but it's an AI bot. And they'll tell you whatever you want to hear. And that becomes a real problem. We have certainly in the past had the promise of technology replacing people as, a cash saving measure with the Phoenix debacle, where they replaced a whole bunch of HR folks that dealt with all the ins and outs of people's pay, laid them all off, brought in a software system to do it instead, and it was a disaster. And the federal government has since spent about $5 billion just cleaning that mess up and ensuring people are just being paid on time, sort of the bare minimum. So that's definitely not what we want to hear. I don't think that the promise of AI is going to replace 15% of staff or do it very effectively. But unfortunately, we may well find out over the coming years.
David McDonald, senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Mass immigration in Canada has reached a boiling point with growing public outcry. The National Citizens Coalition, called NCC, is a conservative group advocating for less government, and they've recently declared that immigration is still out of control. This follows the meeting hosted by Ontario Premier Doug Ford in Muskoka earlier this week, where Canadian premiers and Prime Minister Mark Carney discussed all things Canadian energy, trade, and jobs. But the NCC says, don't just buy Canadian, prioritize hiring Canadian. They cite 3 million temporary residents straining housing, healthcare, and social services, with many now illegal as their permits expire. NCC notes that 1 in 5 workers in Canada are non-Canadians, sidelining citizens in an already strained, tough job market, while a staggering 1 in 88 people are asylum seekers, overwhelming resources alongside rising youth unemployment. This is clearly unsustainable, and it also poses a national security risk. Joining me now is NCC director, columnist, and best-selling Substack writer Alex Brown to explain why politicians continue to largely ignore this growing issue.
Gee, the
Monday CRM has the best AI
partners who love and now increasingly are dependent on cheap foreign labor. And it has been incredibly concerning to be looking at Muskoka and this lavish meeting, it's still an important meeting. There's a lot going on. There is the tariff issue. There is the interprovincial trade barriers needing to get yanked down. But they're signing all these understandings and these promises to do better. But we're still not seeing these energy projects get made. And then meanwhile, we're leaving out what to so many is that elephant in the room, which is that we're talking about protecting Canadian jobs right now in relation to the tariff threat. And that's incredibly important because Canadian jobs are at risk in manufacturing, key sectors, steel, energy, you name it, automotive. But we have hundreds of thousands out of work. We have the town where they were in. I put this in a little video on Twitter as well. I was just walking and rambling, which is up in Muskoka right now, where they've been riding the banana boat, and Carney and Ford have been making s'mores evidently till 12:30 and patting each other on the back, which I think further solidifies people's concerns about maybe the Ford government's and Ford camp's behavior during the federal election. Is that there's thousands of local kids whose summer job no longer exists. There's grocery store workers who've been replaced by 37-year-olds from India, and communities that are being changed by these fraudulent career colleges that just offer management degrees and not the big ones that we actually need, like STEM, the trades, medicine. And whether it is solely to the benefit of some corporate partners or the governments themselves are enjoying, some of the fruits of this labor, it's unsustainable. We're talking about, finally doing right by Canada's promise for the first time in years. The Liberals seem to be course correcting, or at least saying that they are. But until they start hiring Canadian, until we start weaning these big companies, many of whom have massive government subsidies, off cheap foreign labor, it's incredibly hollow because they're not hiring Canadian. We're at risk of a generation of young Canadian citizens failing to launch because they can't even get their foot in the door, because that foot in the door has, that door has been propped open for folks that we've never let in before, and no full discredit to them, but that's not fair. It's not fair to our present working generation, and it's not fair to our future working generation.
Now, aside from the political and corporate elite prioritizing cheap foreign labor over Canadian workers, what cannot be ignored any longer is the growing number of youth struggling to enter the job market. Supporters of the temporary foreign worker program say Canadians, and youth included, don't want these jobs, but Brown warns that this isn't true and instead denies youth entry-level positions and ultimately the opportunity to build confidence and career foundations.
And it's a cope. And I understand that there might be certain companies in very specific instances, but we have record youth unemployment. You go online and you see the TikToks, and these kids are miserable, and like they're even handing their resumes in person, which the liberal boomers online are yelling at them to do, implying that they're lazy. They're not lazy. We all had unglamorous starting points. Like I was pumping gas. I was planting trees, landscaping, doing a terrible job at it, But my empathy for the situation of these kids right now, and for I'm an increasingly an aging millennial, so I'm aging out of the cohort. But I personally can see myself in some of these kids where it's like, if I wasn't able to get an early hand up, even if it was just for a few bucks an hour, I needed to be part of a team. I needed confidence. I needed to get out of the house, especially now with how much time, folks are spending on social media, on apps that might not be all that great for the development of their brains. Like, they need to be out and about, and they need good habits, and without them, you could lose them. They won't get off the launch pad. And so I think it's a fair criticism to say, oh, these kids don't want to work these jobs, or they're low wage, but we all worked low wage jobs, and it's all gotten us to where we are now.
So what is corporate Canada's role in all of this? Well, Brown says that they perpetuate the crisis and even points to a few specific examples, like the controversial lobbying group called the Century Initiative, which advocates for a Canadian population of 100 million by the year 2100, which Prime Minister Mark Carney has just recently appointed the co-founder of to his Council of Advisors on U.S.-Canada relations.
I mean, we have now, for example, 3 million temporary residents, which is obviously straining housing, healthcare, public services, not just jobs. We have hundreds of thousands who are now illegal as their permits expire, with no plan to address this growing crisis or to send them home. We have a new report today showing 1 in 5 workers in Canada are no longer even Canadian. So we're obviously sidelining our own citizens in a struggling job market. If you looked right now, this was just unearthed on social media, the Century Initiative, which is the big sort of mass immigration lobby group, which like sponsors things in the Globe and Mail and is part of this giant sort of op-ed opinion operation to be like, no, this is actually great. Like, so it's reaching 20% in Toronto, youth unemployment. Who gives a darn? If you look at their corporate sponsors, and they like happily celebrate it, it's the major banks. It's huge companies. And we know what these huge companies get out of it. They get cheaper folks, or let's say if we're even trying to give them the benefit of the doubt here, with minimum wage increases in a place like Ontario, which went up by, I don't know, $5-6 an hour over a period of years. If you're one of those companies, let's say you're Tim Hortons, and it's not a coincidence that I'm mentioning Tim Hortons, maybe in your heart of hearts, you truly believe that if you're